Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the range of news items we have for you this week is the amazing effectiveness of the HPV vaccine, and notably just how effective it has been. There is the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine along with this, and the fact that it is safe during pregnancy, despite various claims to the contrary, most of those nonsensical. The consequences of being vaccinated have been shown to have a immunological response or an increase in IgG long after being vaccinated across multiple different variants of COVID-19. This means that even if you weren't given a vaccine for the current variant, you're still protected to some extent. RNA may be responsible, at least in part, for Alzheimer's disease and the neurons that die during it. There is a microbiome associated with semen. In Australia, drug testing in one of their states, specifically their capital state, shows that there are at least 3 drugs in circulation that the government hadn't really known about before now. Tiny creatures turn cannibalistic if they die during sex. Why it is your coffee tastes the way it does. The European Union has caused something of an uproar amongst the environmentalists after approving the various genetically modified foods, or at least rules around them. A novel technology or development in chemistry to be able to swap nitrogen and carbon-based groups. Ongoing criticisms of academia and specifically around Western blots. Britain has put forward a proposal, and specifically their chief military officer, that they must begin training a citizen army, and claims around water triggering a nuclear reaction to produce energy. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with what is arguably one of the biggest health achievements in recent years, arguably second only to the COVID-19 vaccine. That is the HPV vaccine, or Human Papilloma Virus vaccine. This was a vaccine that was intended specifically to treat the human papilloma virus, which was largely affecting women, although to be clear, it affects both men and women. What it caused in women was, at a minimum, cervical cancer. This was hard to identify, and once it was identified, it was often deadly. Stopping it in its tracks is what has happened. Quite literally, there have been practically no cases of women with cervical cancer in those countries that have rolled out the HPV vaccine. Yeah. That's how effective this has been. Almost 0 cases, and in some countries there have been 0 cases. That is a huge achievement, despite the various controversies around it. For example, in Japan, where researchers had to retract an article that was ultimately shown to be bullshit about various health concerns. It was basically anti-vaxxer propaganda. This is why viruses can be tackled with vaccines, and when they are, they work incredibly well. In similar kinds of news, but showing what happens when we don't attack and tackle a disease like this with a vaccine, we have the continuing drama of the UK and the increasing number of measles cases. Yeah. This is a development on last week's news, less about the actual numbers, as the numbers largely haven't changed, but what we do have is better details on where this is happening and, to an extent, why. To prevent the spread of measles, you need 95% coverage. This will give you herd immunity. It's a very high number, and it is arguably difficult to achieve, but once you achieve it, it's much easier to maintain, until anti-vaxxers get involved, and unfortunately that's what's happened. In this case, we know something about what has occurred, and it's mostly the figures have dropped down to 85%, so they've lost 10% of the coverage they need. Further to that, of the cases that have been identified, the large number were to be found in the Midlands, which is interesting. Another notable percentage in Birmingham, and the last significant location being Coventry. Yeah. To be clear about it, measles is not an innocuous condition. If you get infected, there is a high probability that you won't experience anything more but a rash and discomfort for quite a while. However, those who do experience more serious symptoms are going to suffer. And this isn't just little things either. It's not like they're going to be more itchy. No, it can affect the lungs and cause serious issues with that. It can affect the brain, and, well, consequential damage to that is going to be lifelong at the best of cases, if not death. It also leads to issues around the immune system if children aren't treated with it. There are also concerns about sterility for male children, and the list could go on. So this is not just oh, it's only a minor illness. Yeah, most of the time it's a minor illness, but do you want to play Russian roulette with kids in case one of those children is not the one that gets the minor version of this? Next, we have development around the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine during pregnancy. There have been a wide range of claims around COVID-19 and the vaccine during pregnancy. Some of these have been more extreme and controversial than others. For example, some have said that it causes an increase in miscarriages. The data shows that's bullshit. But then again, anti-vaxxers have rarely ever existed in reality, so expecting them to actually use real-world numbers is perhaps a little too hopeful. This is where research into the safety of the vaccine and infant brain development is at least more specific and helpful. Not only have we established that in general terms it's safe for pregnancy, but that there aren't any consequences for the infant's brain development, which is a concern there. Now, we're not going to candy coat the study. It does have some serious concerns, but also those concerns are related to its strengths. First of all, it was spread across all 50 US states. However, individuals were self-enrolling, and all of these study activities were performed remotely, so there are concerns with just how accurate some of the data is. But given the breadth and nature of the study itself, and relatively speaking the roughly 2,500 pregnant women involved, we can say, at least somewhat, that the study is a strong indicator of this pattern, if not arguably fairly well-established and well-evidenced research based in reality. This compares to the publication called Prion-like domains in spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 differs across its variants and enable changes in affinity to ACE2. This study has been used by anti-vaxxers to try and claim that the spike protein that is generated by the vaccines for COVID-19 is effectively creating a prion disease-like protein. Now, this is nonsense. Not only is it nonsense, but it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what is going on when they say prion-like. Understand, most cells have a protein on their surface that is prion-like. A prion-like refers to the fact that it can change conformation, not necessarily functioning as it's normally intended to. This is useful if you want to be able to have a, let's say, flexible antagonist of a particular receptor, something that can dock to multiple variants, or if you want to have a protein that can change its conformation to turn on and off as needed. Prion-like domains in the spike protein of the COVID-19 variants do something similar. The difference is they're able to change conformation to make the COVID-19 virus more infectious. Yeah, it has nothing to do with prion disease. Prion diseases are very specific and very different to prion-like domains in the spike protein. Prion diseases, as we've put in past videos, fundamentally, not only are they incompatible with other proteins, but if they contact them, cause them themselves to mutate and turn into prion disease proteins. Yeah, there's a big difference between being able to change conformation and being able to change conformation and become pathogenic. This is why anti-vaxxers have fundamentally misunderstood what prion-like domains is referring to. Next, we have a study that's also related to COVID-19, but rather than being the, let's say, nature of misunderstanding, it puts to rest some of the claims that COVID-19 anti-vaxxers have been putting forward. That is, whether or not natural immunity or vaccine-mediated immunity is better. In other cases, there are claims that hybrid immunity is the best. And Hybrid immunity is where you've both been infected with COVID-19 at some point, but thanks to being vaccinated, you have a less serious infection. You therefore are able to recover quicker and have fewer consequences. That's hybrid immunity, and arguably, this is what they've measured. The 3 distinct groups. Those who have been infected, those who have been vaccinated, and those who have been both vaccinated and infected. We do want to say before going into the details that this is test tube experimentation, and of course anything in a test tube, petri dish and so on, is effectively very limited in its use. But hopefully with this information there is at least more substantial evidence to show that, yeah, you don't want to just tackle COVID-19 by itself. You would want to have the vaccine within you. What the researchers have found is that if you're infected first, or given a vaccine first, you do have slightly different kinds of antibodies being generated. Now, to be clear about it, they are slightly different. Ultimately, the results aren't significantly different looking at the publication, but nonetheless, it is noteworthy that there were differences. But once you get both infection and vaccine, things change again. The researchers found that if you're vaccinated first and then were infected, you did have slightly lower titers. And comparatively, it's the other way around. If you're infected first and then get vaccinated, you had slightly higher titers compared to the vaccine first group. However, both groups produced considerably higher levels of antibodies to the newer variants, which is important as it shows that at the moment, despite unfortunately the best plans, and reality being that although someone may be vaccinated, they could still be infected with the newest variants, you would actually have a better response to the newest variants and be more protected because you were not entirely protected due to the nature of changing variants since the vaccines were released. There are, let's say, several concerns with the study that we do need to talk about before finishing up. The first and biggest is that it is a really small sample size. Really small. As in we're talking somewhere less than 30 to 50 people. And that's a problem. Due to the sheer size of the study, you actually can't extrapolate out the results very well. And to be clear, they are a very useful indicator, but useful indicators are not going to end up being anything except an indicator. They give you a signpost in which direction to explore. And that's the issue here. We don't see further research yet to substantiate what is being shown. In less ambiguous news, we have a very clear-cut case of improvement following treatment. What is interesting here is that it's a gene treatment used to treat deafness in an 11-year-old boy. Yeah, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has found that if they give this treatment to the boy who was deaf, or it was described as profoundly deaf, they were able to resolve his deafness. It's all down to a relatively rare single gene abnormality, and they've been trying to figure out how to deal with it. We've known about gene therapy for a while now, and in theory, we've been able to do something about them, but it hasn't really been applied, not to many conditions anyway. The sickle cell anemia is one of the obvious examples that's reasonably widespread. This is where the surgical procedure, which involved taking out part of his ear, injecting the virus that would deliver the modified gene, and then closing everything up, was conducted. And this was early October. Now, roughly 3 months later, we're seeing the results, and that is he can hear things, all due to the production of a missing protein. Not everything is sunshine and rainbows for the young boy, unfortunately. It would appear that he's never going to learn to be able to speak, and this is down to the way the brain works. The brain develops the ability to speak somewhere up to the age of 5. Anything after that, and it just doesn't work. So, although he can hear, he's never going to be able to actually speak himself, but the reason they've chosen such an old boy for this is because they wanted to make sure the treatment was safe and effective. It's an FDA requirement, before they looked at doing something similar with younger children, who would show greater benefits. And to be clear, it is good for him, but good for him and actually having all the benefits are slightly different. Shifting to other news related to sensation, but specifically neurology and Alzheimer's disease. It is possible that short sections of RNA could be responsible for telling cells to die during Alzheimer's disease, and this is what contributes to not just the loss in brain mass, but all the consequential neurological issues of Alzheimer's disease. Understand, this is research that should be considered, let's say, speculative, although they do have good numbers, but it is worth taking it with great skepticism. To cut the rather long and complicated story short with this, what they've found is that there are short RNA molecules that are indicated, if not outright known, to cause cell death. This is done by a process called death induced by survival gene elimination, given the rather short acronym of DICE. It's something that does exist normally and largely plays a role in getting rid of cancer cells. But it's being observed in the model that they were using. This included not just rodents, but brain tissue taken from those who had Alzheimer's disease, cell cultures that were grown from this, and a somewhat limited control group. The study itself is, as mentioned, relatively limited in its ability to be extrapolated out. It does, however, if true, open a pathway for a third possible way to tackle Alzheimer's disease. Currently, it's limited to more or less focusing on the tau bundles and the amyloid plaques. Neither of these are exactly easy to deal with. This means that if you could target either that RNA, or ideally a way to increase protective RNAs that would counter it, that's a third doorway that could be used to get into the brain and keep it safe from Alzheimer's disease. In other treatment-related news, we have a novel application of antidepressants. Rather than just being there for when you don't have coffee, antidepressants, based on Chinese research, could kill some types of cancer. Now, we do need to be very skeptical on how we apply this, largely owing to the fact that it's both based in the cell culture and rodent examples, so yeah, the research doesn't necessarily always translate to humans. The medication, called ansofaxine hydrochloride, is an oral medication which would make it incredibly effective for treatment, simply because it's a lot easier to give someone an oral medication, send them home with a box of pills, and let them sort it out themselves. The other consideration with this is just what kind of cancer it's treating, and it's colon cancer. A colon cancer, otherwise colloquially called arse cancer, is very hard to identify until things go really wrong, and it's literally shit hitting the fan. Unfortunately, it's only really identified once you start seeing blood, and you only see blood once the cancer gets to a size where it's really starting to cause problems. At that time, you are in a world of hurt. The way the antidepressant appears to work is, let's say, somewhat questionable. Mostly because the exact mechanism is neither understood, nor exactly are the effects known. We know something about it, just not quite what it's doing. The short version of it is that antidepressants tend to increase the amount of molecules that are dangerous, if not outright toxic, to cancer cells. This makes it easier for the immune system to not only identify them, but attack them, because the more damaged and destroyed cancer cells there are, the more material the immune system has to be able to recognize that this thing's not what it should be and we need to clear it out. Shifting tact entirely from cancer to what could arguably contribute to cancer, semen. Yes, that is a terrible joke about pregnancy, but it's better than calling it an STD. The research is kind of interesting, largely because it sees a relationship between semen, the microbiome, or bacteria involved in semen, and fertility. Now, there has been a drop in the, let's say, sperm count of males in the West for quite a while. This isn't going to affect fertility, but there's also a decreasing number of children being born. This is not just a simple relationship between the amount of sperm and fertility. It's a very multifaceted issue relating to employment, willingness to have children, income, age of pregnancy, and so on. But the role that the microbiome, and particularly bacteria, might play in that is interesting, and it could theoretically be more important if we're talking about something like assisted reproduction. To be very clear about this, semen does not contain any kind of bacteria until it gets to the very end of the urethra and is being ejaculated. At that point, it will get some microbes added to it. This is simply the reality of entering into the world. It's also, according to the researchers from California, contributing to the motility, or the ability of the semen to move. These findings do need to be taken with a lot of skepticism, and it all boils down to the number of participants involved in the study. There were 73 men. Now, the 73 men did get divided into two distinct groups. Those who were in there to be tested for fertility, and those who had already fathered children and were seeking a vasectomy. So you can kind of see how this breaks down. Already clearly able to have children, trying to figure out why they're having difficulty having children. 27 of the men were found to have abnormal sperm motility. It all came down to having an increased amount of lactobacillus in us. These men had that, whereas the 46 men who did not appeared to have relatively little of it. While the, let's say, research is of limited value in and of itself, the basic idea is sound. This is for two reasons. One, the lactobacillus species is known to have a role to play in various STDs and fertility issues. It's also known to produce L-lactic acid, and that itself reduces sperm motility. This double hit could be why it's contributing to lower fertility rates. You have issues to do with the reproductive tract anyway, because of inflammation from the whole infection problem, but also the L-lactic acid stuffs around with the sperm, meaning they're less able to get to where they need to be. God must be quite irate with his creation, given that he views every sperm as sacred. We now move on to slightly more stupid news, and more to simply point out how dumb it is. In Britain, a man has been jailed for 14 weeks for peeing on another person. The reason they peed on them is unknown exactly, but it occurred after being told that they had prostate cancer. Yeah. Most people are not going to be at the urinal, having a very unusual, but hey, it's a Britain discussion, and then proceed to pee on another individual, and particularly their back, in response to being told health news that's not necessarily good. In this case, normally people would just give compassionate understanding and move on. We are wondering if they're one of the weird, bizarre group who think urine will solve all of their health issues. In Australia, we do have other sort of health-related news, and possibly a reason why this guy peed on someone else, related to drugs. Drug testing in Canberra, Australia, has identified that there are at least 3 drugs that haven't been seen in Australia, and they're being used regularly. This is part of a wider, more controversial issue. The issue is twofold, really. First is the fact that the drugs themselves have been tested, and the testing itself is, in different states, seen different ways. Most of them still hold it to not be an approved process, or at least not a funded process. But in Canberra, which is the political capital of Australia, drug testing appears to be funded, which does make sense. Most politicians would have to be on drugs to do what they do. The 3 drugs that were tested were unable to be identified by the testing that was there. The testing's intended to pick up synthetic versions of something like cocaine, heroin, or MDMA. The 3 drugs, because they couldn't be identified using these methods, had to be sent on to a laboratory at the Australian National University. What they found was that the first was a new form of cathinone, the second was a benzylpyrazine, and the third was found to be a phenethylamine. The known functions of these, if they are known, is basically to be a stimulant, which, given the nature of testing and where it's conducted, kinda makes sense. They're intended to make them able to party all night long, which, given the novel nature of some of these drugs, may not be a great idea. Without knowing exactly what they're going to do, you might party all night long and then die of a heart attack. Shifting from interesting but not necessarily hugely important news to sad news of a kind. The avian influenza strain that was devastating Argentina's seal population has made a leap in species, and now we're seeing it killing wildlife. Yeah, H5N1 is a concern. It's now a more significant concern simply because it has mammal-to-mammal infection. That's a big problem. Previously, we've seen infection due to exposure, and this is not exposure in terms of the virus itself necessarily can jump from host to host very easily, but rather you consume so much of it in various formats that it just overwhelms the immune system, and that's how you get infected. In this instance, that's not what we're seeing. We are seeing the virus jumping via more normal mechanisms from one host to another. Understand that this particular strain of avian influenza is the same strain that we mentioned last week in What Were They Thinking, where it killed a polar bear. The concerns there were that it would make exactly this same leap, and unfortunately it appears to have done so. And not just has it made the leap from one mammal to another, but at the practically opposite end of the world. We should be very clear. It's not necessarily explicitly the case that it has made that jump, it's just the most likely explanation at this point in time. Staying in the southern hemisphere, we also have a bizarre behaviour amongst native marsupials in Australia. The bizarre behaviour is observed in the small creature called Antidepressant. It's a native marsupial that will turn cannibalistic after sex. Yeah, let's hope that we don't see this in something like bonobos, where they would probably eat each other to death in less than a week. The species is kind of weird. They undergo what's called suicidal reproduction. That is, they will die after a single breeding period. This means that they put all of their effort into that one, let's say, generation that they're trying to create. And unfortunately, it's all down to their own hormones. It's something that's rarely seen in mammals, and there are only a few other examples that we know of in the world. And you could probably count them on one hand. You could probably still count them on one hand even if you're missing fingers. That's how few there are. And it's why this species is kind of weird. But the fact that they're weird for dying after having sex is made all the weirder by the fact they die after sex, and those that survive eat each other. It is important to note that the males are the ones that die. The females obviously have to go on to be able to get that new generation. What is noteworthy is when they die and why they may be eating the dead males. They die at the end of winter, and because it's the end of winter, there isn't a lot of food about. But fortuitously, they've just been provided with a meal. Yeah, it's very convenient, isn't it? Australia, the land down under, just continues to be the gift that keeps on giving. Shifting to food-related news, we have an interesting article that looks at the carbon footprint of urban gardening, and more specifically urban agriculture. Think of things like community gardens and similar. They found that the carbon footprint of this could be 6 times larger than farming itself produces. Now, the research itself does need to be taken with some skepticism for a range of reasons, as not everybody is engaging in urban gardening purely to be self-sustaining or similar. Rather, a lot of them are doing so as a social and pragmatic point of view. They enjoy the activity. They also enjoy the social element, and therefore they do so. There's also, let's say, a limited application of this to certain crops in particular, tomatoes being one example. What they found was that if you're going to be eating something that is generally grown in the greenhouse or has to be shipped very quickly, for example, air freight of asparagus, the impact of growing it locally is going to outweigh the cost of importing it. Therefore, the import of it or bringing it to you via shipping or growing in a greenhouse is much greater production of CO2. In a related piece of agricultural news, we have an explanation about what it is that makes arabica coffee taste different despite being genetically very similar if not the same. That is, why if you buy a particular batch of coffee from one place and another from another, they will taste so distinctly different despite being so similar. And the answer seems to boil down to not just a small genetic variation, but more importantly, mutations that are in that variation. That is, although some may have certain genes, some may have different versions of that gene. Others may not have it at all. Shifting from the existing knowledge to application of what was an incredibly bad idea, Brighton in the UK decided it would use no weed killers at all 5 years ago. This was a great idea, they thought. Let's follow the example that the organic industry has of using no herbicides. Well, now they're switching back to using them because they realized that was a dumb idea. And not just a dumb idea, but it led to huge issues across their entire council. The result of their decision was a huge increase in the cost to tackle weeds, and because they simply couldn't keep up with the demand, various parts of their municipality have been overtaken with those same weeds, whether they are thistles, nettles, or something more innocuous. In a similar vein of stupidity, environmentalists in the European Union are throwing a hissy fit after the European Union has, in their words, relaxed the rules. To be clear about it, the rules aren't really all that relaxed. They are simply actually allowing you to get approval for genetically modified foods. This is a huge change from where things were before. Previously, they wouldn't let you get approval for any genetically modified food, or at least not without ridiculous levels of difficulty. Now they've gone with the position of, okay, as long as you fit within these specific criteria, we will let you apply, and if there are no issues, we'll move ahead. The vote itself was fairly clear. 47 votes to go with it, 31 to go against, and 4 people abstained. The big caveat with this, let's say, change in the law comes down to the way they've divided the genetically modified crops. They've created 2 groups. The first is those that are comparable to existing products or plants that are grown as crops. These do not need to go through any pathway to be able to be approved, really. They can effectively be used as is. Now, to be clear about it, these are comparable plants to what's currently out there. The second group are those that do need to be changed and aren't comparable. These do need to go through the current requirements as they exist, which is ridiculously difficult hurdles. Shifting from what is honestly just people throwing a stupid fit over nothing, we have slightly more useful but also useless news. The chickpeas being grown in moon dust. Now this might sound really cool, but that's really it. At the moment, we don't have a lot of use for this information. If we were to, for example, ever create a moon base, it would be very useful. But right now, not so much. What is important to understand here is that they had to make modifications to it. This included the introduction of fungus and earthworms. Without this, they would not have been able to grow the chickpeas. This is because the lunar dust or soil is pretty much inhospitable to life. There is practically no organic matter within it. Moving to news that's pure chemistry, we have a somewhat novel development. And to be clear about it, we're talking novel, but also very, very, let's say, to be polite about this, controversial and new research. The research itself is supposed to be able to take a nitrogen in a chemical, or a nitrogen group in a chemical, and swap it out with a carbon-based group. Now, this could be incredibly useful, notably if you're trying to make modifications to active groups in a molecule to be able to change its useful applications. So, for example, if you have a particular molecule and you know its one group in one location is useful, but it also causes bad consequences, you can swap it out for this other group that has the same result but doesn't have the negative elements to it. Shifting from research focused purely on developments to what is arguably a broader criticism of academia. The first of the articles on this are related to a tweet and publication from Harvard Health. The article creates a relationship between vaping and a condition called popcorn lung. Popcorn lung largely being the sound you hear when listening to someone's breathing, and the crackling associated therewith. The relationship claims that vaping, and particularly vaping of nicotine-based products, can cause popcorn lung, and this is also somewhat related to the diacetyl flavoring used both in vaping products and some cigarettes. The problem with a Harvard article is similar to a range of other research recently, which is the actual dose present isn't sufficient to lead to the condition that is claimed to be associated with it, or the health concerns that are claimed to be associated with it. And therein lies the problem. Harvard has effectively tried to make a case that the presence of diacetyl, purely and by itself, is enough to lead to a relatively rare condition, which isn't really well substantiated, and why, for instance, the tweet and the publication itself received a lot of criticism. It is arguably not so different to the American Associated Pediatricians article trying to link glyphosate or other pesticides and herbicides to the use of genetically modified crops. It doesn't actually make a case because the doses don't represent a real-world risk. Harvard Health has even managed to drag the mysterious respiratory disease from a few years back that was down to the presence of vitamin E into this. They've effectively conflated the role of that with nicotine products, and unfortunately, that wasn't really present in nicotine products. It was largely present in unregulated THC or cannabis-type products, which is a problem. One of the major problems with this article and the criticisms that are associated with it is largely the lack of distinction, the lack of clarity, and the conflating of several different and distinct events or issues. As a result, they basically managed to screw up what should be a relatively straightforward instance. This does this, and if you do this with it, you also get another problem. And sometimes, if you have these particular other set of variables, you get both. Instead, they've just thrown everything against the wall and seen what would stick. This is not the only time that academia will be in trouble this week, though. The next is all about Western blots. Western blots are a process used to be able to isolate different materials. We're talking in this instance about the role of protein. That is, if you were to take, for instance, a cell or a tissue sample, macerate it, liquefy it, and then filter out anything that's not protein, and then put the protein in the blot, you would see it separated by size, and it would basically give you an idea about the amount, to an extent, of certain proteins present. Now, to be clear about it, it will tell you about the size of the protein, not necessarily what they are, but if you've designed your experiment correctly, you should be able to figure that out. This, of course, assumes that you're doing two things. One, you have a well-designed experiment, and two, you're not manipulating the images of those Western blots. It's this latter one that is a bigger problem at the moment. You can design a good experiment, and if it doesn't show results, there's one of two possibilities. You screwed up, or there are no results to speak of. This is why you generally run multiple lines of investigation along with a Western blot. This means that if the Western blot comes up with nothing, you need to run it again because you've obviously done something wrong. On the other hand, if your Western blot and your other lines of investigation show nothing, there's a good chance there is nothing. This is where, unfortunately, manipulation of the Western blot images has found its way into a lot of different places. One being the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, which has effectively been highlighted as an example of academia manipulating the images and creating fraudulent images that are used to justify certain claims. The problem that the article highlights is not just that this happens. By itself, that's a problem. But using the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute as an example, it is the scope, the deliberateness of it, and the fact that it needed to be extensively integrated into all levels of management and research. It isn't just one rogue researcher. It had to be multiple different laboratories within the institute, all in concert, working to achieve various different kinds of fraud, and involving multiple individuals within each laboratory conducting this fraud by manipulating the images, being told what to manipulate them to and how, and ultimately creating results that in some cases would be invalidated, but in other cases doesn't actually change the results at all in the end. There's also a rather good article, however it is incredibly long, that goes through the Dana-Farber, let's say, debacle. Understand, cancer research is a well-funded industry, and as harsh as it is to say, perhaps overfunded as at this stage. The issue is not the funding itself, it's now how do you effectively apply that money and get the research out there. And, well, the Dana-Farber researchers have shown that perhaps you have bigger issues than just execution and money. In other higher education related news, we have what is arguably good news for about 74,000 students in America. They've just had $5 billion of student debt wiped out. Now, this is interesting, largely owing to the fact that student loans in America are distinct from most other countries. They're generally going to be a private loan. Now, there is government funding for some of this, and this is what has been, let's say, wiped out by the government, or more accurately, administration's order. That's not so much the problem here. The problem is that there was a Supreme Court case last year that struck down the majority of what's just happened. The majority of those individuals who are receiving relief under this payment system, or plan as such, are largely in the public sector. This is going to be, for example, people like teachers, nurses, firefighters, but there's also about 30,000 individuals involved who have been making their repayments, and the repayments are made through income-driven repayment plans, but never received the relief that they were meant to get under said plans. It is entirely possible that, with the way the world is now, that many of those students may just be able to qualify for the GI plan instead. This owes to the fact that, well, Britain at least is recognizing that they need to train their citizens in a military way, creating what is described as a citizen army. This comes from their military chief, head of the army to be specific, given that they've got at least 3 different military branches. The government believes that they need to increase their reserve forces, and not just increase their reserve forces, since that just wouldn't meet the demand that they expect to see coming, but rather they expect that they're going to have to effectively mobilize a large portion of their population, something more akin to conscription than, well, reservists, unfortunately, and it comes down to the threat of Russia, at least according to the UK's military representative. But what is worrying with this is twofold. First of all, as the representative for the military says, the a war is effectively started with regular military members, but it's continued and to a certain extent won with citizens. The second element to it that's a concern is that it's not just the UK that is taking this position. Most of Europe and NATO in general is also holding to the same idea. They are increasing their preparations for war, which is a concern. A war is never good, but yeah, the reality is that over the last, let's say, 30 or so years since the Cold War came to an end, most countries have been decreasing the size and preparations of their armies. This is why those same armies are now underfunded, understaffed, and in some ways underprepared. Some countries are better set up than others, but most are experiencing issues of various kinds. The last article we have for you this week is more a very preliminary and very questionable article coming out of China that has received all kinds of attention, both good and bad. It is entitled, "Water can trigger nuclear reaction to produce energy and isotope gases." In short, water can be used to make nuclear power. This sounds amazing, and it sounds about as amazing as the room temperature superconductor, which was shown to be fraudulent, so this is why the kinds of articles like this that get a lot of attention, especially from the media, need to be taken with a lot of skepticism. Now, the article itself has received, let's say, a lot of attention from other academics, and some of these are, let's say, low-hanging fruit, while others are more realistic. Some of the more, let's say, base criticisms are about the language used. And yeah, that's a fair enough criticism, particularly if it makes it more difficult to go through the article. Others are not so much so. For example, the article does reference quite a few sources of information in one go. You'll see this in things like reference 1 to 10. And 10 different references for what is a single sentence is really hard to be able to get out what it is that is being attributed to what source. You would be better off either having the individual references associated with each individual element of that claim, therefore you probably have 3 different reference sections within one sentence, which is a mess, or you'd be better off having multiple sentences that exist and having the appropriate references attached to each sentence. But that's not the worst of it. The worst is that a lot of the references aren't to peer-reviewed publications, which is a worry. A lot of them are just to generic websites. That's not where you get referenced information. No, just no. The reason you do not cite random websites in peer-reviewed publications is perfectly exemplified by one of their citations. It is a pseudoscientific magazine from Russia, which is purported to show an anti-gravitation platform. Yeah, the platform is evidenced by 2 photos. One of the man on the platform on the ground, and a second one of the man on the platform while it is up in the air. Understand that it's just 2 photos, more than likely with one taken once the guy had jumped with the device. Yeah, this is why you need peer-reviewed citations. There are also concerns raised around the conflicts of interest. The fact that most of these individuals, or at least a significant number of them, are involved in energy-related businesses. As you can imagine, being in a research role where you're publishing on something that a business you're actively involved in is also going to show benefit from you publishing in, there are concerns. These have, of course, been somewhat addressed, and in other cases not addressed at all yet, in places like PubPeer. So, as a result, these and other concerns do, let's say, warrant the editor's note, and unfortunately the editor's note has been, let's say, lashed out at by various people who claim that it's just a sign of xenophobia. To start with, the researchers are from Taiwan, not China, and as much as China might like to claim Taiwan has been part of their territory since ancient times, Taiwan seems to take a rather different stance. The second issue is that just because they're from Taiwan, and theoretically China, does not mean that they're not able to, engage in the same fraudulent activities as any other academic. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.